One of the very first people I ever met in Dignity. Oliva and I know each other from 1982, when I joined Dignity Boston. And Oliva had already been there for several years, 4 or 5 years already.
Since 75.
Since 75, so 7 years at that point. And she became a real mentor to me, both in making sure that I felt comfortable and welcome in the Dignity community. She fed me for my first plantains, taught me how to make those, and also introduced me to feminist theology with a Latin flair and a historical flair. So all of her amazing credentials, Oliva's really recognized as one of the leading feminist scholars and psychologists in the world. And we're very fortunate to have her here, a retired professor from USD, and just so I get the title. SDSU.
It's not the Catholic University, it's the State University.
State University.
Yeah.
See, I should have put my glasses on. But the title of the workshop, Reading Teresa of Avila, Women's Friendships, Sappho, Melancholic Nuns, and Other Puzzles. Very intriguing. Welcome, Oliva.
Thank you. Okay, so unfortunately, I had a lot of little pictures here that you're not going to be able to see. So I'm sorry about that. Can everybody hear me clearly? Okay. So I have, what I have here, it's sort of an outline for myself so I don't get lost. But feel free to, raise your hand and interrupt and whatever, because if what you ask is something I intend to say, I'll say that. And if not, we'll make sure that you're following what I'm trying to say. So, as Marianne said, I've been professor of women's studies and psychology here in San Diego for 32 years, after a number of years in Boston. And I have my most recent books, I have a screen here with them. One of them is a memoir of childhood in Cuba. The other is about immigration, which is what I have done mostly, women and immigration. And then there's this one, Women, Sainthood, and Power. And you're welcome to take a look at it. And I have 3 chapters on Teresa in that one. So, I'm in love with Teresa. I've been in love with Teresa all my life. So there's a lot to be said about her. She's certainly very important. She was the first woman named Doctor of the Church by Paul VI. And she's basically a teacher of prayer. But there some interesting things about her, and in fact, in the Encyclopedia of Lesbian Cultures and whatever, and History, Elizabeth Stewart, I suppose you know the name, she's a British theologian, has a section on her and her connection or not with lesbians. So what I'm going to focus on today is that very specific part, even though there's a lot more to say about her. And this is not, if you wish, the most important part of her life, but it's very important, very interesting that a woman who's the first doctor of the church has some association with lesbians, and we'll get to that as we go. Let me talk a little bit about her family first, and her story first. So we are going to be talking a little about her life, then we're going to focus on one chapter of her life, then talking about, mental prayer, things like that she contributed, and the importance she placed on the value of women and the value of women's friendships to be able to learn how to have a friendship with God, which was her purpose. And then at some point in there, she talks to the prioresses in her book about foundations about what to do with melancholic nuns, who are supposed to have too many emotions that could create trouble in the convent. So that's basically what we're going to be talking about. Okay. So Teresa was born in 1515, so a few years before Martin Luther and the beginning of the Reformation. And as a reaction to the Reformation all over the world, but particularly in Spain, there was a very strong counter-Reformation, trying to reform the religious orders and religious life, and etc. And she was very involved in that she brought the Carmelite Order, first for women and then for men, with the help of John of the Cross, to come back to the original idea of being a very ascetic community, where nuns and priests, brothers, etc., were in their cells praying or doing common work for the community. And one of the revolutionary things is that everybody did everything. In other communities, and even in Carmel, up to that point, rich people came into the convent as rich people with servants. And nuns who were not highly educated did the menial work, while the other ones did whatever they did. In the Reform, the work of the community rotated, so everybody did everything. And she's famous for a number of particular saints, but one of them is, God is among the pots and pans. So whatever you're doing, it's still something that you're doing in connection with God. She ended up founding many monasteries at the same time that she was experiencing these visions and these, but you know, those things are not necessary as such, although that's one of the things she's most known for. The other thing is she had a lot of struggles with male authorities in the church, in Carmel, and in regular government. The Inquisition was after her more than once, and in fact, she wrote the book of her life because her confessors wanted her to describe what her life had been like, her life of prayer, basically, so the Inquisition will know what she was doing. And they basically sequestered the book of her life because they thought it was dangerous that she was talking about mental prayer, which, you know, for us now, it's perfectly normal that you have your own private conversation with God. But in that historical moment, private conversations with God, prayer, your own personal private prayer, saying your own words, smacked of Protestantism. You were supposed to be saying Our Fathers and Hail Marys and the office and whatever prescribed, and everybody had little books that had prayers written in them that you were supposed to read and repeat rather than saying your own things, because the devil could tempt you if you were doing your own prayers. And we all know that women are very weak and very vulnerable to the devil. So it's particularly dangerous for women to pray using their own words. So when she was not only doing it herself, but trying to get many more women to do it, you can imagine that people were not happy about what she was doing. Luckily, Philip II, who was the king of Spain, very rigid, very conservative, very strong about the Counter-Reformation, like Teresa. So she, whenever things got out of hand and nobody paid attention or people wanted to create trouble for her or something, what she did very nicely was she wrote a letter to the king and eventually her problems were solved. So she had a knack for getting men in authority order her to do what she wanted to do anyway. She was very good at that kind of thing. So she, that's why she was able to do a number of things. At that time, the Inquisition forbade practically every book about prayer written in the vernacular, but in Spanish in this case, because they were in Spain. And she was very annoyed with that, because she thought, since women could not read Latin, they could not go to university, they could not learn Latin, their only resource to learn how to pray was reading books that were written in their own language. And the Inquisition forbade practically all those books. So she said, okay, so I'll write the books, and I'll say the things for my nuns, supposedly, but in the process, of course. And those books we're still using. The Book of Life, The Way of Perfection, which was written for her nuns particularly, and The Interior Castle, which is her biggest treatise. And The Interior Castle is about prayer, but it's about human development. It's sort of a description of how you get to know yourself and become the person you are. And it's full of theological interpretations that are very important. Not only about prayer, but about human life and about understanding of the relationship between human beings and God. Gillian Algren, one of the things I had here, but you won't be able to see it, is a list of resources. Gillian Algren has a small book entitled Entering Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle that is magnificent. It's very clear. It's very well put together. She has several books on Teresa, but this one on the Interior Castle is wonderful. Okay, so in terms of writing, there's the Book of Life that has been translated by different authors, or not translated, because sometimes it's not, even in Spanish, because it's the Spanish of Don Quixote. So you need to try to understand what she's saying, even when she's writing in Spanish. So, and then there are several English translations through the years. There were different people who edited her works with notes and etc. And we are going to get to one of those in a moment. So the Life, The Way of Perfection, The Interior Castle. Then she has a book about the foundations and commentary about the Song of Songs, Spiritual Reflections, and a gazillion letters. She wrote letters to everybody, and that is also an important compilation. So one important thing to know is that Teresa's grandfather and her father, when he was an adolescent, were punished by the Inquisition because they were converted Jews, conversos, as they said as they call them in Spanish. And in fact, they were not punished more severely because the grandfather, who was very astute, accused himself to the Inquisition of committing the sin of Judaizing, meaning, praying on Friday evening or whatever it may have been. So he and all his sons were made to march through the streets of the city of Toledo, which was, at that time, one of the most important cities, the capital of Spain for a while. And they marched through the streets dressed with this thing called a San Benito, which looks like the Ku Klux Klan kind of outfit. But in this case, they had their face out, and everybody would know that they were Jews who had been practicing Judaism while pretending to be Christians. So they did their, all the Fridays of Lent, they did their repentance, etc. And then grandfather packed and went to Avila, where nobody knew him. and bought a title of nobility and pretended that they were all Christians. So for many years, the people when she lived, of course, knew sort of where the family had come from. At least some people knew. And one of the interesting things of the reform is that she admitted conversos in all her convents, which some other congregations were not admitting conversos, because if you were a Jew who had converted, nobody would trust you. So, and some of them did it just out of convenience. So, in a sense, there may have been some reason for that, but basically the main reason was prejudice. Yes.
But you said her grandfather basically outed himself as a
yes,
Jew?
the grandfather knew they were going to be coming for him, I guess.
So there was some advantage to
yes.
doing it?
When you honestly
yourself.
said, I did this and I'm
Yeah.
repentant and, oh, I'm terribly sorry, they were kinder with you and they didn't take your property away, which is what, yeah. So he, you know, there's a lot to say about Spanish society during this time, but one of the interesting things is that Charles V, which was King of Spain and Emperor, etc., sold a lot of titles of nobility to converted Jews, so he could go fight Luther in Germany using that money. And that's one of the... So the people in Teresa's time, probably the people who knew the family, although even though Toledo and Avila are relatively close, at that time it was several days of walking and no internet. So there was no way for some people even to know what had happened in the other town. But even if some people knew, because there were other markers there. For example, that Teresa and her mother knew how to read and write, and most Christian women didn't. And so there are some signs like that were there all the time. But it was actually in 1940 that someone found the documents of buying the title of nobility. And it became confirmed that she, in fact, came from a converso family. But at the time when she was living, of course, people knew that she was coming from a converso family, and they knew that this was her background. So a converso and a woman who's having visions, food for the Inquisition, right there. Okay? So that's part of that. Okay. Other things, I have here a picture of what her birthplace looked. Have any of you been to Avila? Okay. So this is a picture, my fuzzy picture of her birthplace. Her mother died at 36 from childbirth after having 9 children in 14 years. So Teresa was then 12, 13, something like that. And she was always very aware of the dangers to women in married life. And we tend to think that, you know, okay, married women outside of the convent are freer. But from her perspective, women in the convent were freer because they could do whatever they wanted to do as long as they stayed there in a way. And they could read, they could write, they could pray, which is what she was most interested in, while married women had to do what their husband wanted them to do. And there's no birth control. So they're having one baby after another. All those stories, fairy tales, that were there as children of a stepmother, it's because, in fact, women died in childbirth very young. Her father had 2 wives. Other men had 2, 3. Philip II had 3 different wives because the wives died very young, as opposed to what tends to happen now, that the men tend to die and the women are the widows. At that time, it was the other way around. And the early death of her mother impressed her very much. So she talks in her life about, in the book of her life, about all this. And then there's a point, and this is where we are getting to our substance here. In chapter 2 of the book of her life, she talks about the bad influence that friends can have. Her mother had died, so she was an adolescent. And there's a cousin, a girl cousin, who came to the house regularly. And she, this cousin, and the other girl induced Teresa to sin. Now, practically all commentators assume that these cousins facilitated her encounter with boys. But it's not clear at all. She's talking about the danger of this girl and the other one who was like her, it's her term, who used the other one who used the same pasatiempos, the same pastimes. So these two girls induced her to sin. And you know, one of the things Elizabeth Stewart says is Teresa is talking about sin. She's not saying this was a good thing. So there's a negativity in what she's saying. But in terms of whatever her experience was, it can be as much a girl as a boy. And as I said, she never talks about boys. She only talks about these two girls. So there were some people, at least in 19th century Spain, who thought that the sin was with girls and compare Teresa to Sappho. And I mean, it's 19th century. It's not like the other day. And here's some words of some of what she's saying. There was an older cousin who spent a lot of time at our house. This cousin was the one I liked to associate with, for she encouraged me in all I desired and introduced and immersed me in pastimes I had never dreamed of. She and another girl of the same type who influenced me to do even more dangerous things. With the thought that my deeds would not be known, I dared to do many things truly against my honor and against God. But my sense of honor gave me the strength not to completely lose my reputation. There's more, but that's okay. Now, Vita Sackville West, I don't know if you know who she was. She was Virginia's, what's her, okay, her lover. So she was, anyway. So she writes a biography of Teresa that she wrote in the early 30s. And in it, she talks about this and about someone who wrote about this, some editor of Teresa's writings who reacted to this. So I went hunting in libraries and found these, again, you can see it, but it's a guy named Vicente de la Fuente, who did an edition of Teresa's work in 1861. And I have the footnote in Spanish. I would have shown it in Spanish, but let me read it to you in English in my translation. So when Teresa is talking about this, there's a footnote in the chapter 2, written by this guy. And the footnote says, "It was not a long time ago that there was a strange notion in Spain of comparing Saint Teresa with Sappho. The divine love, pure, sublime, beautiful, and superhuman, that throughout all her life, except scarcely 3 months, occupied Saint Teresa's heart, does not admit comparison with the lascivious, crude, and licentious love of Sappho. The only possible comparison is antithetical, as between Christ and Mohammed, between light and darkness, or between a beehive and a hornet's nest. No one has the right to confuse love with lust. And, I mean, the note is actually more revealing than anything, in a way, you know. Again, I went hunting. I spent I don't know how many days in Madrid looking at libraries to see in journals, in magazines, in different things, who may have been saying that comparing Teresa with Sappho, and I never found it. But obviously it was there because this guy took the time to say it wasn't him. Something I find very funny about this guy is, why would it be lascivious if it was with a girl but not if it was with a boy? You know why, because of his prejudice. But you know, it's a very, he has such a strong reaction and such, you know, prejudice around this whole thing that it almost makes it interesting. It almost makes you aware of something much more even than what Teresa herself wrote, because he has such a strong reaction against it. So this is the thing about the comparison with Sappho, that I don't know where it happened, but it happened in the 19th century, and it created a strong reaction in this guy. Okay, so that's one thing. And, I mean, the point is that someone in 19th century Spain assumed that Teresa was describing an experience with a girl or with girls, and the assumption was well enough to merit this guy's reaction in 1861. That's the thing. Okay, so mental prayer, as I said, was going to some of the things of Teresa. It's talking to God directly, and one of her famous sayings is, praying is nothing but talking to a friend who we know loves us. Mysticism during the Middle Ages and during this time, early modern Spain, so 15th, 16th, early 17th century, is a source of authority for women because they did not have any other source of authority. Men could be priests, bishops, scholars, governors, kings, whatever. Women couldn't. So their only claim to having something to say, as it was for Teresa and several other women, was to say, I have a direct communication with God, and this is what I'm getting from God. And Teresa keeps talking about, this is my experience. This is what God does to a soul when you really try to communicate with God. So that was her very important point. But it's a source of authority. And she, in fact, had a lot of authority. Again, the king is writing to her and things of that sort. So she's founding these monasteries. In fact, she died in Alba de Tormes because she was very, very sick at that time, traveling. She had ovarian cancer, apparently, that had metastasized to her throat. So she was really in horrible pain. And the Duchess of Alba, which are like the highest possible nobility in Spain, wanted her next to her daughter who was delivering a baby. So Teresa went there because, you know, she was sort of ordered by high authorities to go there, and she ended up dying there. Mm-hmm. So she was considered a very important person even during her lifetime, which doesn't happen with everyone who eventually becomes a saint. So again, here's a woman who comes from a Judeo-Converso ancestry. She's a woman. She's teaching about mental prayer. Of course, the Inquisition would take a look at her, and yet she persisted. And there's a famous statue, I think I have it here, you have seen it, from Bernini from the 17th century, where the angel is piercing her throat and it looks as if she's having an orgasm. And there are lots of reactions, particularly from women, because Lacan used it to talk about women's sexuality. And there are a number of women writers who say, what do you know what she was experiencing? This is Bernini's version of what she was experiencing, but he's using it as if this was really. And there are a number of paintings of the transverbration, which is what that experience is called, painted by women. Again, I have a couple of examples here, that don't look like she's having an orgasm. Okay? She used a lot of her authority and a lot of her mystical experiences to talk about the value of women and the power of women's prayers. And she talks about how important that women cannot go to the field to fight against Lutherans. In a way, she's more Lutheran than many Lutherans, but that's besides the point. Women cannot go to the field to fight, but women can pray, and their prayers have value. So she talks about the importance of friendship and love, and being in a small convent where everybody knows each other and loves each other. But it's important to not fall into particular friendships. We know that term, right? So it's important to not get into particular friendships. And she talks about it in Way of Perfection, in Foundation, and in the constitutions of the Reformed Carmel. But she's not talking about those as sin. She's talking about them as becoming disruptive in the convent. Because if you have a group of 12 people who are living together constantly, and 2 of them are going to the side to talk to each other and take care of each other and say endearments to each other and defend each other if something goes wrong, you start getting divisions within the community. And she says it's particularly dangerous when the prioress is the one who falls into liking one of the nuns more than others. And of course, the prioress needs to seek counsel of the intelligent nuns in the community, she says. But still, that doesn't mean that the prioress has particular friendships, because they can create a lot of division. So in her convents, she's trying to push for friendship, but